Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're jumping into a really fascinating journey. We're going to seamlessly bridge the gap between ancient mathematics, the absolute limits of human logic, and a classic historical narrative about human failure. It's all about uncovering how the things we cannot know actually end up shaping our destiny. It's the limits of human knowledge meeting the comfort of divine providence. So let's just dive right in.
So consider this, like the ultimate intellectual question. Can human beings know absolutely everything in the world? Throughout history, tons of the greatest thinkers out there believe the answer to this was an absolute resounding yes. They firmly believe that human intellect had zero structural limits, as long as we just had the right tools in our hands.
A prime example of this supreme confidence, ancient Greek philosophers, most notably Pythagoras. You remember him, right? By using mathematical principles, like the famous Pythagorean theorem we all kind of struggled through in middle school, these ancient thinkers believed they had literally found the key to unlocking the entire world. Think about it. If you know two sides of a right triangle, you can mathematically deduce the third, right? To them, numbers were this invisible, perfect system that completely ordered the universe.
And then Plato comes along and actually takes his Pythagorean concept and completely expands it. After traveling down to southern Italy, which was the hub of Pythagorean thought back then, he brings these ideas straight back to his academy in Athens. He started teaching that despite how chaotic the physical world looks to us, there's a perfectly structured, invisible mathematical order governing literally everything. And this idea, it's spread like wildfire. It was so influential that early Christian thinkers, like St. Augustine, leaned heavily on Plato's concepts to try and systematically understand God and the world. This sheer intellectual confidence really hit its high watermark in the 19th century. Back then, there was this massive, supreme optimism. Intellectuals were actually boasting that humanity was incredibly close to understanding absolutely everything in the universe. But, well, then the 20th century hit, modern physics completely shifting the paradigm, and a mathematician named Kurt Gödel introduced a major intellectual plot twist, his incompleteness theorem. Basically, he proved mathematically that any complex system has blind spots it simply cannot explain from the inside. There are actual structural limits to human knowledge. Long story short, we literally cannot know everything.
So that begs the question, right? What is the one thing humanity can never, ever fully comprehend? Well, if we apply Gödel's concept of incompleteness to ourselves, we hit a stunning conclusion. The ultimate unknown is myself. Structurally and logically, sure, we can figure out the universe, but the second we try to look inward and fully analyze our own selves, we hit an absolute brick wall. And honestly, this structural limitation totally flips how we view Socrates' famous quote, "Know thyself." Instead of just being, a nice little piece of philosophical advice on a bumper sticker, it's actually an almost impossible challenge. We fundamentally cannot fully know who we are, how other people truly perceive us, or the deep, dark depths of our own motivations. To really see the catastrophic consequences of this specific blind spot, we can look over to biblical history, specifically King Solomon. Now, Solomon represents the absolute peak of human wisdom in biblical history. The guy built a massive empire, enjoyed unprecedented wealth, the whole shebang. Yet, despite having all this universal knowledge, he lacked true self-awareness. And this huge blind spot eventually led to idolatry in his later years, and it ultimately left his fragile kingdom totally unprepared for his son to take over. So after Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam takes the reins, and this sets the stage for a massive leadership test. We're looking at the crisis at Shechem. Rehoboam travels up to Shechem, which is the center of the northern tribes, for his coronation. Now, this location alone is a huge red flag signaling deep unrest. While he's there, a leader named Jeroboam, who had actually fled to Egypt earlier, steps up to represent the people, and he demands lighter labor. Rehoboam plays it cautious at first. He hits pause and takes 3 days to consult his advisors. Now, check out the crazy contrast in the advice Rehoboam gets here. The elders, they give him a super pragmatic, lenient approach. They say, just speak kindly, and the people will serve you forever. They clearly recognize that Rehoboam doesn't exactly have his dad's natural charisma or wisdom. But then he goes and asks his young peers, the guys he grew up with. Their advice? Be harsh. Tell the people your little finger is thicker than your father's waist and literally threaten them with scorpion whips. Wild, right? So, connecting this historical event right back to our earlier premise, we can see exactly why Rehoboam rejected the elders' wisdom. It wasn't just some random political miscalculation. It was a fundamental inability to know himself. He was completely blind to his own insecurities. Kind of like an animal puffing itself up when it's scared, his fear manifested as this desperate need to project a totally false show of strength just to impress his buddies.
Because he didn't know himself, he couldn't see the value of the elders' wisdom. And the result? The kingdom literally split in two. But here's where it gets really interesting. Behind this massive historical failure is a profound theological twist found in 2 Chronicles 10:15. The source text says, "The king did not listen to the people, for this turn of events was from God, to fulfill the word the Lord had spoken through Ahijah." So beneath Rehoboam's utter foolishness, his closed ears, and his totally fatal ignorance, a divine plan was actually perfectly unfolding all along.
This brings us to the overarching theological concept here. We're looking at what happens behind the failure. Basically, where human self-awareness completely fails and creates absolute disaster, divine providence steps right in. Think about it. Rehoboam closed his ears, he ignored advice, he lacked all self-awareness, and he failed miserably. Yet God had already spoken through the prophet Ahijah way before this. God already knew the outcome. The source text implies God is never caught off guard. And he was accomplishing his purpose right through the very structural limitations of human knowledge we talked about earlier.
To really grasp the emotional weight of this whole thing, we've got to look at the historical context. The book of Chronicles wasn't just written in a vacuum. It was written for exiles who were returning from captivity in Babylon. Imagine them looking at the ruins of their divided nation and their completely destroyed temple, desperately asking, "What happened to us?" The answer provided to this ruined, traumatized community was that even in their ancestors' most incomprehensible failures, God was always in control.
And this theme doesn't stop there. It extends all the way into the New Testament. The Apostle Peter's speech at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 points out that even humanity's darkest, most ignorant act, the crucifixion of Jesus, was governed by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. The source text illustrates that the greatest human rejection was actually used to bring about the greatest divine salvation. Bringing this directly to our own modern lives, there is a super powerful realization here for us. Today, we might never truly understand why we suddenly snap and act out of anger, or why we succumb to fear, or why we stubbornly ignore perfectly good advice. We have that exact same structural limitation as Rehoboam. But the ultimate message here is that we aren't just left alone in our ignorance. Our personal lack of self-knowledge doesn't have to end in total despair. That emotional payoff is perfectly summarized by this concluding scripture from Psalm 139. "O Lord, you have searched me and known me." It's saying that right where we hit the absolute brick wall of understanding our own minds and our own motivations, we find the comfort that God fully knows what we cannot. We are fully known by our Creator. So let's just quickly recap the beautiful arc of what we've explored in this explainer. We started with those ancient mathematical theories and Gödel's proof, coming to the realization that human knowledge has a hard, structural limit. And that limit is ourselves. We saw through Solomon and Rehoboam how our blind spots often lead to our absolute deepest failures. But ultimately, the theological perspective we looked at shows that God's providence completely encompasses and even uses those mistakes. Because of that, our human limitations aren't a reason to panic. Instead, they're an invitation to trust the one who actually knows us fully. I want to leave you with one final, really provocative thought to chew on. Based on everything we've unpacked today, if your greatest failures, your deepest insecurities, and your blindest spots are already fully known and held within a perfect divine plan, how does that change the way you face your own limitations today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this deep dive has given you a profound new way to look at what you know, and maybe more importantly, what you don't.